Okay, a very kind welcome to all of you on this Wednesday evening in Singapore. I'd like to first of all thank all of you for spending some time with us this evening as we try to make a little bit of sense of the wonderful world of testing and admissions as we stand in Singapore. My name is Jeremy Craig. I own a company here called Testtakers. I've been doing test prep in one way or the other since I was an undergrad in New York City many, many years ago. And I've continued to do it since I moved to Singapore almost 20 years ago, a little over 20 years ago now. I'm joined this evening by Sean McAuley. Sean, turn on your video so we can see you, man. There's Sean. Okay, unmute yourself as well. Jeez.
There we go.
Here we go. Sean is the Deputy Secondary Years Principal at Gems World Academy and has many, many years experience on the guidance side of getting kids into universities at a number of schools. Most of the schools in Southeast Asia, Sean's either worked there or been there a few times. We have a lot to cover tonight. I'm just going to share a screen here. And this will be recorded for posterity and will be up on a YouTube channel that will be linked to my website, the Testtakers website, within 72 hours or so. I'm going to have to do some editing to knock it down a little bit. Any questions during the presentation, put in the question function of Zoom, and then we're going to address most of them as we go, and that we've already seen the questions beforehand, and we tailored the presentation therefore. Also, the most recent blog posting that I put on my website, I basically just took the most common questions from that and made an FAQ that I put on my blog. So a lot of those questions are addressed there. And obviously a lot of people are asking the very same questions, which makes perfect sense. So you see, we're going to be going through this, Sean and myself, and then at the very end, we're going to be doing an interview with Mr. Eddie Azandi, who's an old friend of mine and a creative director at a small company called Google. So we'll talk a little bit about what he did and how his education journey and whatnot has come to pass. Now, in terms of what we're going to cover, it's a whirlwind. We think we're maybe a little overly ambitious in scope, but we'd rather do too much rather than too less. Talk a little bit in passing about the rest of the world, mainly UK, Europe, Australia, New Zealand. And then we'll be talking more specifically about the America and what's going on there as much as we can imagine, and try to prognosticate a little bit about what we might see happening 9 months down the road, 19 months down the road as we get into the successful school years. We're talking a little bit about just a brief overview of the SAT. What is it? How is it scored? How is it used generally? Then we talk a little bit about what test optional really means. And again, all American universities right now, outside of University of Florida, are entirely test optional, which means they don't require scores. Then we do some recommendations by year, and then on to conclusion and Q&A. Okay, now I've been saying this for months now, since the world started falling down. There's a Chinese aphorism that's 摸着石头过河, which means to walk across the river by feeling for stones. And that means you don't really know what the next step is going to be. You just have to plan it out as you go. Now, a lot of us are kind of type A personalities, want to get everything planned out ahead of time. Oftentimes, we just have to figure it out as we go and just kind of roll with the punches and see what develops in the weeks and months ahead. We're not going to know all the answers today. We're not even going to know all the answers in 6 months, but we just have to sort of be prepared for the various outcomes that may arise. Now, one thing we'll hark back on as well, there's a lot of fake news floating around the world right now about a number of different things, be it vaccines or whatnot. Also on international applications and university and this world, there's also a lot of bad info floating around. So if you hear about it from a friend, if you hear about it from someone else, blah, 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 be very suspect. Be very suspect. Only trust the international school counselors if you're working with an international school, or that failing, the university itself. And oftentimes the universities will update things on Twitter before they update things on their respective websites. So a lot of application checklist websites right now are only relevant for this year and might be changed entirely next year. So you don't want to do a whole bunch of excess work that you don't really need to do. Okay, now I'll turn over to Sean for the first one here. This is blocked here. This is UK and Europe. So Sean, I have to go through this now.
Yeah, I think one thing for parents to remember is that while we here in Singapore and most of Asia, we're back in school and things are doing fine. A lot of schools in Europe and the UK have gone back to online learning for a while, then they're back in person, sort of back and forth. So the universities there are still instructing students, but a lot of them aren't necessarily in class. But what happened last year was a lot of students did defer. And this question has come up again and again from parents and saying that since a lot of kids last year deferred and won't be starting till 2021. Is that going to make it harder for my child to get into this coming year? There's a possibility that it might, but I think, as you know, because of the situation, a lot of international students just aren't going to be going overseas at all. So while the applications could be more competitive, there'll just be more seats. I think one thing to keep in mind is that the deadlines might be extended for a lot of programs coming up. So for parents out there, when you're looking at any UK or Europe institutions, be careful to double check the deadlines. I'm trying to think, just the other day, UCAS sent through a note that in the past, students had to decide by like May 28th, I think, on their firm and insurance choice. And now they're giving an extension to everyone coming through, which will give students a chance to kind of reevaluate where they stand grade-wise and their chances of being admitted.
Okay. Oops, sorry. Okay, now we're going to the South, Australian schools, and they really have been heavily affected by this in that the way the timing hit with COVID is right at the start of their school year. And then more recently, there's been some pretty big geopolitical friction with China, which of course was the #1 sender of students to Australian universities that largely depend on the foreign dollar to keep the lights on. So it'll be very challenging indeed to see how the Australian universities muddle through this, and that they're going to need a pretty big bailout from the government. And the government right now is not keen for that sort of thing for helping out the intellectuals in the RV towers. So it'll be very interesting indeed to see how this develops. But you know, Aussie schools are great, and they're going to remain great. It's just going to be a little bit of a hiccup here. Sean, anything to add there?
No, I think because of the application cycle, and keep in mind that because most of them start in February, a lot of students are hopeful that by students that will be graduating this year are really hopeful that by February, it's going to be much easier to get back into Australia and hopefully, you know, start university on time. Obviously, Australia is sort of like Singapore has handled the COVID situation admirably. And we think everything should be back to normal in Australia by the time students look at starting next February.
Yeah, and we certainly were a bit very lucky in Singapore the way it's transpired. But if a travel bubble opened up with Australia, I'd be on the second flight out of here, I think. Just been cooped up here for a while now. Now let's talk a little bit about America. Sean, you want to take the lead here?
Yeah, I think the big thing here is that there has been a huge drop in the number of foreign students enrolling in America. Obviously, the COVID situation, you know, in America is not getting any better. So this could carry on into next year. I think on top of that, even before this, a lot of the relationships between the US and China had soured, and the US government was making it harder for Chinese students to get visas. We think that will change with the new administration coming in. So I think it will be much easier for international students to enroll at universities and get visas, and hopefully also get the work visas to stay. But I think the damage in a lot of ways is done. And so a lot of international students that, I mean, I've seen this just in the past 3 or 4 years, students that had always sort of planned on going to the US, or at least were considering the US, are now not even considering the US, and they just don't want to go. They're looking at Canada or Australia. So what does that mean? It means a lot of universities are going to have more open seats for international students. However, I will qualify that by saying that the most selective universities, the big name universities, are not seeing a dip in applications and are not seeing a dip in the number of students enrolling. So while it could be much easier to get into a lot of sort of lower first tier and second tier institutions, the most competitive institutions are going to still be just as competitive as they have been before. The big change, as Jeremy mentioned earlier, is that the SAT is now optional for practically every institution in the US. In fact, most institutions have actually signed off on something saying they're going to be test blind. So the question, and it was a legitimate question, came about and said, well, some students will have the SAT, some won't. If they're going to submit the SAT scores, isn't that going to influence your opinion of them? And this was pushed hard by NACAC, the National Association of College Admission Counselors. And they really pushed institutions to sort of take a vow to say, look, we're really not going to look at the SAT scores, and we're not going to favor those students that were fortunate enough to take the SAT. So we believe them and we stand by that. So students that are applying this year, you know, the SAT will really not factor into your admissions. For IB results, AP, A-level results, those will be coming out as usual in June. And so those are obviously going to be a factor for, so Canadian universities that, for example, that do want to see a 4 or 5 in your standard level math class, they're going to get those IB results, which means, you know, you'll still be able to get your college credit and those things will still continue. And that was true for the class that just graduated as well. Some parents were nervous that perhaps because there weren't exams, the colleges might not accept the IB or AP credit, but they ended up accepting it.
Yeah, but and it's something I've seen over the years as well, Sean, sort of dovetailing with what you said. A lot of kids are only applying to say one or two American universities, almost as extended reaches, and then then the rest of their options are in the UK, Canada, Australia, etc. So they're only applying to ridiculously competitive schools. If they get in, great, but if not, they're kind of giving the other schools in America a miss.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. A little bit about the SAT test. Okay, this is my one. SAT grew out of a test that was given to people who got drafted into the Army. If you did really well in this test, you ended up as someone's valet or driver in a base somewhere. If you didn't do well, you were the guy at the front of the row who went over to Omaha Beach in France and got shot first. After the war, they had to have one standardized test because, again, in America, we can't agree on anything. So there's 50 different states, 50 different education systems. The SAT provided a standardized yardstick to help provide one metric that schools can kind of tell students from different systems apart. Now, it was taken by over 2 million students here, making it most widely test taken. Now, it's an important, I'm talking pre-COVID here, it's an important factor, but certainly the most important factor is your academic record, particularly IB, things like that. IB represents 2 years of hard work. SAT results how well did you take a test on one Saturday morning. So schools are aware of that, and there's no minimum SAT score, even pre-COVID, to get into any American universities. Now, there are elsewhere, but not for the States. Most, again, as Sean alluded to, the test now is optional at all American schools. What I'm kind of hearing, Sean, it's a little bit counter, is that for the most competitive schools, if you have a score that backs up your IB, it definitely isn't going to hurt to submit it. But if you don't submit it, then they're not going to penalize you because they know you probably couldn't take it.
Yeah, I think as always, if if you have a good test score, you should send it.
Yeah.
The question is that, are they really going to look at it or not? Again, a lot of them have said they won't be focusing on it. Again, I think we trust them, but then again, a good test score is something you should always include on your application.
Yeah. And the upcoming test dates, there are 5 per year. There's rumors of them internationally. There's more in the States. There's rumors of them adding more, but we haven't really heard that for sure yet. And scores have no set validity period in that they're valid for 5-10 years, but definitely you probably want to take them while you're still in school if you have national service concerns, because national service is not going to help your grammar. So I see kids whose scores go down when they go in the Army. So definitely try to get the testing knocked out while you're still in school and still engaged academically.
Yeah, I would just add for national service students, it's really crucial you take it in school because you may not be able to get that Saturday off. I've had some national service students, they asked 6 months in advance, oh, can I have December 5th off? And their CEO says, yes, you certainly can. And then a week before the test, they say, oh, no, wait, no, we're going to have you do something this weekend. You're being deployed somewhere else. So you're never going to be guaranteed to be able to take the test because the Army controls you and decides when and where you're going to be.
Yeah, well put. In terms of the test format, now you can take a look at the SAT just by going to the College Board website and just looking at sample tests. They're there, they're free. 3.5 hours long, multiple choice, score range 400 minimum up to 1600 max. Scoring over 1500 is extraordinary score. Scoring less than 700 or 800 is really hard to do. You have to actively try to get questions wrong. The average score worldwide is about 1,000 and change, 1,020, 1,030. There are 5 sections. First is a long reading section, followed by writing, which is English grammar. Your kids' English grammar is terrible, trust me, and that's where we see the biggest improvement in our programs. Math is not that hard math, but it's tricky math, a lot of tricky word problems, but it's not in that much depth. But one thing I think I allude to later is that we found that the new IB math curricula, which are great, don't necessarily cover a lot of the more advanced math until well into the first year. So I get kids, even kids who are doing the AAHL, who haven't seen certain concepts yet when I see them in the fall. So it's always best to hold off a little bit and just cover it in school first. The essay is dead. It's going to die. The vocab is still tested, but it's tested through usage and context rather than just straight up vocab like we would have saw back in the day when we took it. Grammar's key. You need to know what a dangling modifier is. You need to know verb conjugation. And again, kids now with TikTok and all that, their grammar just isn't that great. And again, we spent a lot of time on that in our program. Just talked a little bit about the math. Again, there's no calc on the SAT. a lot of my most advanced math kids, particularly those in the American system, are doing Calc BC in junior year, and they just haven't seen a triangle since like they were 12, because they've been so far advanced and spending every weekend locked up in a Kumon center. So a lot of them have to kind of circle back and just go through some more rudimentary stuff to move forward from there. The reading also always contains a passage that's a founding document, they call it, which is basically going to be something from American history, American Civil War, American Revolutionary War, or the Civil Rights period. So if you know who the good guys and the bad guys are, it certainly is helpful for understanding the context of those passages. And the new format is suspiciously like the ACT, and I'll talk a little bit about the ACT in just a bit, I think. Essay is pretty much dead. It used to be required by University of California, and now University of California has been mandated to be entirely test blind, so that's no longer a concern. Median SAT scores at selected schools. Again, 4,000 schools in America. You've all heard of the ones on the right, which are the most competitive because they get the most applicants. Are they materially better? Well, certain programs might be better at University of Connecticut than USC. It depends kind of school by school, faculty by faculty. And the schools in the middle, fine schools, wonderful schools, all land grant except for American, wonderful schools that are just amazing institutions, as are the schools on the left. So again, if you want to get a feel for where you're at SAT-wise, most universities will give you the upper and lower 25th percentile, the 75th percentile of students who are accepted into that school. And they might also give you a number of students who choose to enroll in that school. Now, some schools, Northeastern, also would send students who don't score so well abroad for the first semester, and then they don't get counted in that metric. So there's all kinds of games that schools play with the scores. Hopefully your school, your international school, would use something like CALFO, or what are the other ones, Sean? CALFO, UFrog, all those new ones?
Maya Learning is the other big one.
The other big one.
Maya Learning.
And that will give you a good indicator of, students from my international school with this IB result, this GPA, who've had a 1200 on the SAT, who got in, who didn't get in. Don't give you the names, but just they'll check or tick over who got into what schools, and that'll give you just a ballpark of where you're at. Now that said, the stat I love to throw around is that in the last 5 years, pre-COVID obviously, 70% of students with a perfect SAT score got rejected from Stanford. And you better believe that all those kids also had like a 4.4 GPA and a 44 IB. So having a perfect score and a perfect SAT doesn't guarantee you're going to get into any hyper-competitive schools. It'll guarantee you're going to get into Texas Lutheran or University of West Virginia. But in terms of the most competitive schools, it's almost just another tick on the box, and you're better off doing other things to help with your application. Okay, anything to add there, Sean?
No.
Okay, and we could talk for days about the application process, but we don't get there too much. So again, we've tread on this ground before. All schools are now test optional. Some have gone so far as to go test blind. University of California was forced to by the courts. And a lot of people are asking about, what about 2022 kids? I know most of the people who signed up are present 11th grade juniors who will be applying 12 months from now. Most of the schools are saying the policy will continue into next year. They're kind of viewing this as a experiment. Now, the question is, why would schools want to use the SAT? It's a terrible test. Well, it's not great. The issue is, if you're a small liberal arts school, Reed College, or someplace like that, you have a team of people who read all the applicants, you interview everybody, et cetera, and you don't need an SAT. You don't need a standardized test. If you're University of Michigan, you get, 50,000 applicants, and all GPAs are a little bit different. And particularly high schools in America have different GPAs. Certain schools have grade inflation is worse than others. So a 4.0 at the American school here is not equivalent to a 4.0 at the American school in Hong Kong. And unless you're a university that has institutional memory and metrics that know about this and can interpret that data, the SAT just provides another data point for them to look at, but not necessarily the be all and end all, because again, grades are most important. And this year, about 70% of Americans couldn't access the SAT, forget about the ACT. So as a result, schools have said, listen, we can't require something that you can't do, so go ahead and apply. That's basically it. So again, everyone's a little bit different. All the schools have their own policies. It might be a little bit fluid right now. Check the school websites, check the school Twitter feed, ask your advisor. Don't listen to your friend of a friend who heard from somebody that they met at the club in Dubai, and I heard that this. No, get it from the horse's mouth as close as possible, because the situation is a bit fluid. So Sean, anything to add there?
Yeah, I would just add that a lot of US schools, again, pre-COVID, were actually going test optional if you had IB grades or if you had A levels. Because
Yeah.
again, as Jeremy said, they just want to know from an external organization that your grades are a certain level. And you know, if your IB grades, if you have these final IB results, then they know that your grades have been externally assessed by someone outside your school. So just because your teacher likes you, you might get high grades, but the IB is not going to have that sort of favoritism. So it's a benchmark for students. And even if you have good IB grades, if you've got a good test SAT score, that just kind of verifies to the university that your grades are where they should be.
Yeah, absolutely. I another thought there, but it went away. That's fine. Okay, now SAT, essay, and subject tests are probably going to fade into irrelevance. Subject tests were required by only 4 or 5 schools, and 3 of them have dropped it: Harvey Mudd, Caltech, and MIT, because every single kid was getting a perfect score, and then what's the point? They're going to go away. The essay is probably also going to go away. Our hot take, though, is if you're going to take the test, Sean, what do you feel about this? You might as well take it with the essay because it's just another hour, another $18, and you might be applying to some school in Denmark that wants to see the essay. Who knows? You know, you don't know now, so you might as well do it.
Yes, absolutely. There's no downside to taking the essay. To be honest, most schools don't look at it, and even those that require it actually don't pay much attention to your score. And I will say, you know, most international students are coming through schools that have a very strong writing program, especially compared to what you might get in the US public schools. So most of the international students that I've seen in the past 15 years do very well in the essay anyway.
Yeah.
So what I always tell students is go ahead and take the essay. You don't really need to prepare for the essay. Certainly don't need to over prepare, but you're going to do fine on the essay because likely you've been writing these types of essays in your school anyway. And then just in case there's the one school that does require the essay, I do believe some of the Australian universities that require the SAT have to take the essay.
Some of the schools here too.
And yes, schools in Singapore. So always go ahead and take the essay is what I tell my students.
Yeah, it's just to add to that, it's basically looking for a 5-paragraph analytical essay, but you look at someone else's argument. If you can't do that by the time you're a 12th grader in high school, then you're gonna have a hard time in college, right? So they're not looking for a New Yorker thought piece, looking for a basic analytical essay. It's not that hard. It's not that hard to get a good mark on, but again, it doesn't matter that much. And I hope they just die. I hope it just goes away and make life a whole lot easier for everybody. So again, test space in Singapore. This isn't an issue for many right now. I encourage anyone to check my blog posting where I got into this in some length, analyzing what the problem was. The main issue is that the local MOE schools, Anglo-Chinese Junior College, Victoria Junior College, are huge institutions, and they used to take the lion's share of testers in Singapore. Those schools now are unable to host tests, so everyone rushes like rats to the other test centers that are very small. So it's a supply-demand gap. So right now, the best that you can do is if you go to a school that is a closed test center, you know who you are, even then, register early, register often, because I know that one of them even was full up for the December test because of all the distancing rules they have to implement now. If you do not go to one of those schools that is a closed test center, I have instructions on my blog about what to do. You have to choose, let College Board find me a place. And then this has been an issue for a long time with kids coming to take the test from China, but let College Board find me a place. And then when those test centers open up in Singapore, people will be allocated seats to take the test at the Singaporean centers. Now, when that happens, it's anyone's guess as good as me. Please use the COVID tracking app because they say unless we get to 70%, they're not going to go to stage 3. And right now we're just at 50% of using the app. So everyone can kind of do their part. So hopefully it happens first quarter next year, and then people are able to test in either March or May. And again, I get into the weeds a little bit on the blog post for that. So go ahead and do that. Us here at Testtakers, I can't help you get a seat. Sean at GEMS, he can't help you get a seat either. Phoning up New York City College Board to try to get you a seat, it's a waste of money because you have 10,000 kids in New York area with the same situation. So importantly, normally these problems only hit international. Now it definitely is global. So you have kids everywhere not able to get a seat, and College Board is just completely overwhelmed by the entire situation. The important thing is, again, like we go back to again and again, universities need students, and they're going to change the rules to make sure that they get them no matter what. And a lot of the changes that are coming for the next admission cycle, so 2021-22, we don't know yet. We don't know yet. People are just sort of spitballing, thinking about what might happen. I think people are kind of seeing how it goes this time around, and then they'll reassess things and maybe make announcements, what, March, April, you think, Sean, about
Yeah,
what things are going to be for next cycle.
yeah.
Okay, in terms of how to prepare, when to test. Again, like I alluded to earlier, the test covers what you learn in school anyway. So holding off and testing later generally leads to better outcomes. The more books you read, the better you're going to read. The more math you do, the better you're going to get at math. It's just the way it is. But don't wait till your second year of NS. Normally, the second half of 11th grade or the first year of IB is a good time to take the test. The March test date is a nice one. May is a little bit dicey as it gets into the exam season. I had a lot of kids took the test who were 11th graders in December. And for one of the big schools here, that also hit right when their final exams were. And I was a little worried about some of them getting over the line effectively because they had to sort of split their efforts. Doing a bunch of prep way too early is a waste of time and money. I have a graph on this later, Sean. I inserted that again. And again, the tests cover what you learn in school anyway. I already talked about the math and the IB. You can take the test multiple times. And then you can choose which combination of scores to send to the university if you opt to send scores. You might not. So it's not a one and done. This isn't like it just one shot and that's your entire life. So you can take it multiple times, but don't take it more than 2 or 3 times. That's just excessive because you know what? You're going to keep getting the same score again and again and again. I'm a pretty good golfer, and if I go out and play every day, I'm going to keep shooting basically the same score again and again and again because that's just basically what I'm capable of, right? And that's not really going to change. I will say everyone's a little different. Talk to your guidance counselor, talk to your university counselor. They know you best. So people phone me up and their first question is, oh, when should my kid take the test? I was like, I haven't met your kid. What's your guidance counselor say? And so listen to those people. They have your best interests at heart.
Yeah, it's something I would add for parents, and this is really crucial to follow up on what Jeremy said. Colleges and universities are going to look at your grades first, and then they will then sort of glance at your SAT score to see if that matches up. If, for example, you're having your semester exams in December, and you're also getting ready for the SAT in December, that means you can't do both of them to the best of your ability. So it's, if the student is looking at taking the SAT in December of grade 11, and they're spending their time on that, and then their December grades are lower, they've basically ruined the chances they had of, matching up and reaching their full potential. So I think for most IB schools and most American school systems, March is really an ideal time. You don't have any major semester exams coming up. You don't have your mock exams. And so that gives you the chance to get the best grades you can in December of grade 11, take the SAT in March, and then go back to school and really focus on getting the very best grades you can in June or May of grade 11, because your grade 11, semester 1 and semester 2, that's the December grade and the May-June grade, those are the grades most colleges and universities are going to focus on. So if you're preparing for the SAT and your December semester 1 grade or May semester 2 grades drop, you've really hurt yourself when it comes to a college and university looking at your transcript, and you've actually, any gains you might make in the SAT, which would be very minimal because you're going to be busy studying for your exams, are really going to hurt the chances of your application being viewed favorably by a university.
Yeah, and just to add to that, if a junior would take the test in March and then would be able to take the test again in August or October if necessary.
Yes.
The October test date, a lot of people think that's too late. No, it's not too late at all. Even the December test date is, generally speaking, okay for most schools.
Yeah.
And just one thing, Sean, I realized I didn't have a slide on here, is the ACT test. Now, I covered this in my blog posting as well. ACT, Coke, and Pepsi, they're pretty much the same thing, 80% similar. I won't get into the weeds of the exact differences. The main difference is the ACT cannot be taken outside of America right now. They kind of threw up their arms and said, okay, we can't deal with America right now and international. They went through a leadership change. They got rid of their CEO. The nice guy we know worked for them in Asia got fired, as did all the other international staff. And they pretty much canceled the test up until April of 2021. I checked this the other day. You can go on and register to take the test ACT in Singapore in June, but I just have questions about how they can come back after being absent from the market for so long. And even before they left, the ACT was a computer-based test that you had to take at a designated test center that had very limited capacity. We're talking only maybe 20 or 30 seats per test date. So I just don't really, and they're going to be more worried about making sure that people in New Jersey are able to take the test, not people in Topaio.
Yeah.
So
I would add to
yeah,
that you know, if it's my niece or nephew that's in grade 11, I would look at them doing the SAT. If they wanted to register for the June ACT and just give it a try to see if they get a good score, that's fine. But I wouldn't make that the only test, because from what's happened in the past, you may be registered to take the ACT in June, and then 3 days before they might cancel it. And then
yeah.
so then you wouldn't have a test score going into your grade 12 or your senior year. So what I would advise, this is what I've advised my students is, you know, plan on taking the March SAT if you're going to need it. Then if you're really happy with that score, you're done. You'll never have to take another SAT or ACT again. If you didn't do so well on the SAT and you maybe want to give the ACT a try, you could do that in June. But again, my concern would be that they might cancel the test at the last minute.
Yeah, and a lot of people think there's this rumor going on forever that the ACT is easier, and it used to be 5 years ago, but changes have been made, and now it really isn't. If you do well on the ACT, you're going to do well on the SAT. If you don't do well on the SAT, you're probably 99% sure not going to do well on the ACT. Because in terms of the content, about 75%, 80% of the two tests are the same. The difference being that the ACT is taken on a computer, which is a kind of a wonky system. So computer-based testing is a bit like cold fusion. It's always been 10, 15 years away, and we're really not there yet. It's like the classic song, if you can't be the one you love the one you're with. And the SAT is the one that we can at least try to access more easily than the ACT. And again, this is covered in some detail in my most recent blog. Onwards, how to prep early. So if you're in 9th, 10th grade, oh no, what do? I gotta get ready. I turn business away every day from 8th, 9th graders looking, well, not them, but their parents looking for SAT prep. It's too early. You don't need to. You don't need to. They cover what you learn in school, work hard in school. One challenge is reading. I challenge how much any of us adults read for 65 minutes straight. I hardly ever do. That's required that you do that in the first section of the SAT. What do you want to read? National Geographic. If you can read The Economist magazine and understand everything, you don't need my help because you're in great shape, because that's something I can't do every week. So just reading articles, reading anything without too many pictures will help you for eventual success on the SAT, and indeed eventual success academically. Because when you get to college, you will presumably still have to read books, and that's something that kids, I frankly don't think they do quite enough of yet. Ken Burns' history documentaries, this is because of that American history passage. So if you happen to know the Civil War history, it's definitely going to be useful. The English grammar course, not SAT grammar, just English grammar on Khan. It's about 10, 12 hours long. It's wonderful. It's great, start to finish grammar course. Core math skills, I find a lot of, particularly if kids kind of bounced around schools a little bit, they might have missed geometry at some point. So you just kind of want to find out, okay, what topics are going to be on the test, and then just knock those off on Khan Academy. I recommend Khan Academy to everybody. I do Khan Academy just for fun. I find there's only about a 5% take-up rate. So the tricky bit with Khan is being there and doing it without mom hitting you with a stick every 5 minutes when you alt-tab to something else. Don't do a stack of practice tests. Please don't do a stack of practice tests before you do formal prep or want to take the test. It's a bit like if you want to learn how to play golf, you could go out and just hit balls. You just give an eight-year-old a 7-iron and a bunch of balls, and they'll eventually figure out how to hit it, but they'll figure out how to hit it maybe the wrong way. So doing a whole stack of practice tests early will just reinforce bad habits. And I would say at the most, do one practice test, maybe if you want to just get a feel for the format of the PSAT, if you're doing that in 9th through 10th or 11th grade. One thing to mention about PSAT, it doesn't matter. If you can't take it, don't worry about it. It doesn't matter now more than it ever hasn't mattered before. So it doesn't really matter. Don't stress about that test. We have our Grammar 101 and Reading 101 courses that run 2 or 3 times during the year that are good foundational exercise, only 12 hours long. And they're the good foundational courses for the younger kids to sow the seeds of eventual effective test prep. Basically, the first thing you want to do when you sit down to get ready for the test is take a practice test. The first day of all my programs is a practice test. And 2 or 3 times a year, I get to make the wonderful phone call saying, your son/daughter scored a 1570 on the SAT. They don't need to be here. Okay, go on your way, have them join math club or something. There's other things they could be doing. Similarly, I also have to make the phone call occasion when kids score very low, and we just have to have a serious chat about expectations, about score optional, all that sort of things moving forward. So take a practice test. Where should you take a practice test? College Board website has 10 practice tests. Those 10 practice tests are legit, and they're the same ones on the Khan Academy one. Don't go to any test prep center to do a practice test. The tendency is to torpedo the score, so it seems like this kid is scoring lower than they actually are. In terms of how long to prep, we'll talk about this next slide, 2 or 3 months max. You know, you're not going to get much more out of it than that. And when I say that, I mean once or twice a week. This is not a full-time course. Don't take like a month off to prepare for the SAT. That's crazy. Guaranteed improvement are a little bit hard to do because a lot of the diagnostics are scored very punitively. Top scorers don't necessarily make top teachers. I know some really smart people who I wouldn't want to teach anything because they're just kind of like a little bit weird. So you want someone who's been through the process themselves and has a little bit of energy in the classroom, because let's face it, the content is rather dry. Also, one thing to look out for is the best people to do your university advising are the university advising teams at your respective schools. There are a lot of yahoos out there, more and more every day, who claim to will help you get into these schools. You pay us $5,000. I view these people with a very dim eye. I think many of them are charlatans and frauds. There are people who do it reasonably ethically, but very few who do that out here in Asia. And that's something that I will say. A lot of times, maybe you're not hearing what you want to hear from the guidance counselor at the school. So then you search around, find someone who will tell you that. Well, there's some truth to what you're hearing the first time around. So Sean, anything to add on this one?
Yeah, I would just add, if there's students out there and to the parents out there, please, the reading element, as Jeremy said, is the most important thing. I'm guilty of this as well. I started reading in Kindle, and I do read the news on my phone, but I still try to sit down and read The Economist for a couple hours a week. But I can't read like I used to. I think it's the whole digital age. And for a student that is not ready to sit down and intensely read something very closely and critically for an hour, they're really going to have a hard time. And so that's something they need to start developing, as early, well, in 6th, 7th, 8th grade, but 9th and 10th graders, you need to really read. I actually, just in my house, I actually started subscribing to the Straits Times, the hard copy, so that it's there for my children to read. And I actually try to read it as well. So those are the things, those type of things, really academic reading is what's absolutely key to do well on the test.
Yeah, I'm resisting Kindle because I know myself, and I would start reading 7 books at the same time. So I'm still kind of old school, and again, just I can't read like I used to either. Just too many distractions. I'll play with my cat or something, and then I'll go back to doing other things. So building up that reading stamina is really the hardest thing. And to be honest with you, writing the grammar, that score goes up the most. Math, that goes up a lot as well. Reading is the trickiest wicket, the stickiest wicket, if you would. If a kid just hasn't read before, there's not much we can do in 6 or 8 weeks to get them to become a more engaged reader. Of course, there's tricks and strategies, but there's only so much you can do. Okay, so Craig curve is what I call this. I see kids come to me, their SAT score goes up, and we optimize our program about 45, 50 hours. Then they score and get full marks. And then we actually, kids who keep doing SAT prep after that, we oftentimes see their score goes down because they get test fatigue, And really, honestly, all that time would be better spent working on their other academics, sports, other aspects of their personal development, CCAs, than trying to get an extra 20 or 30 points on the SAT. The SAT is a woolly metric. So it's not like a school says, oh, you're only a 1490. We're going to accept this kid with a 1500 instead. No, for all intents and purposes, those two kids, SAT-wise, are going to be identical. They're looking for your score to be in kind of a fuzzy ballpark, and then they look at all the other factors.
Yeah, I would just add, if you start to look at university admissions, you'll sort of start to see some clear ranges where students with above an 1100 have a much better chance of getting in, or students with above a 1200, above a 1300. But the difference between a 1320 and a 1350 is within the margin of error, and the universities know that.
Well, yeah, I'd say the margin of error is probably 30 to 50 points test on test. So, and that number gets higher the higher you score. The higher you score, the way the scoring works, each question becomes worth more. So you can get one question wrong in the math and go down to 770, depending on the test. But I won't get into the test scoring too closely here. Okay, now, Sean, turn over to you for the other exams.
Yeah, so just this question keeps coming up in the office, but right now the AP is sort of provisionally planning on paper-based exams, but as you know, or as you may have heard last year, they were online. Given the situation in the US, they could perhaps go online for students, but we'll have to see. Here in Singapore, we're quite different though. So IB exams, they went on as normal in Singapore. Now, schools in South America, obviously have been, a lot of them have been on distance learning. So schools in South America that were taking the November IB exams, they weren't sitting those in person, but here in Singapore, exams have gone ahead. For May, right now, the IB is saying all IB exams will be happening in May, and I see no reason that places like Singapore, China, Vietnam, Thailand would cancel those tests like they did last time. Students even in Hong Kong, which has been off and on online, but students are back in. Unknown for other parts of the world, we could have a situation where students in, say, Germany don't sit the IB exams, where students in Asia sit the IB exams. We'll just have to kind of see what happens. If you're not aware, but I think most parents are aware though, but the IB did make some adjustments to the exam papers for students that'll be taking the exams in May 2021. They reduced some of the content to make up for the fact that a lot of students were, learning online for 3 to 6 months. GCSE and A levels, that's sort of a big question mark. Right now, if you read the news, the UK is sort of back on lockdown, but schools are in session. So I think that, if the GCSE and A level exams are going to happen in the UK in May and June, then obviously they'll be happening overseas. Who knows? It could be canceled, but I have a feeling that the A level exams will take place. Especially with the vaccine rolling out, I don't see any reason to suspect that those exams will be canceled. So for students in Asia right now, I think exams for IB and GCSE and A levels are going to happen as usual.
Yeah, I mean, all these exam bodies want things to go back to normal desperately. They don't want to do online testing. They don't want to do any of that. AP kind of dodged a bullet by doing that, the shortened system, and they didn't take that much flack for it. But with A levels and IB, A levels in particular, took a lot of guff when they did it based on assessment, and that's not someplace they want to be. And they know that just doing based. I mean, the whole point of these external grades is they are externally assessed by unbiased people who don't know the identity of the kids taking the test. As soon as you're a kid's teacher, there's all kinds of inherent bias that goes in there. So they want things to get back to normal. Okay, moving on here. Okay, what to do by year? So Sean, maybe you can take 2021. 2021, you're pretty much you're done and dusted by this point almost, right?
Yeah, so students that are looking at the US, they've pretty much all applications have been sent off or they're about to send them off now. So that's the current grade 12s. They're in good shape. For 2022, I think, students, if you can take the test in March, I'd give it a try if you're looking at the US. But again, it's probably not going to be required. Universities aren't going to require it. However, given the situation in Singapore and, around the world, hopefully looking better, if you have a good score, you could obviously send that score. But keep in mind that students currently in grade 11 or the junior year, it's not just about grades and test scores in the US. You need to be able to show that you've done some things outside of the classroom. Obviously, it's a little bit difficult this year because a lot of the volunteer service projects aren't taking place in Singapore, but still there are other opportunities for students to be involved in things in the school. I know a lot of competitions this past weekend at GEMS, a lot of students were taking part in a debate competition online with students around the world. So a lot of these things are continuing online. So it's important students stay involved in those things. And then for students that are, the class of 23, 24, study hard, get good grades, and read books. That's the really key piece of advice. I'd say academically, don't start spending lots of time doing test prep right now. You need to get other things on your application. One thing that often happens is students will sort of realize at the middle of grade 11, oh, wait, I don't have much on my application. I need to start doing activities now. That really doesn't look good. Universities and colleges in the US want to see students have been dedicated to something for 9, 10, 11, and 12. So it's important, whether that be a sports team or just World Scholars Cup or taking part in MUN, they'd like to see that you've actually sort of had a commitment to something through 9, 10, 11, and 12. So be a good student and then take part in your school community. It is that simple. Do the things you like. There's no reason to sign up for a lot of activities and sort of do this and that just to kind of put a number on your resume. Colleges are looking for deep commitment over just having 10 different activities on your resume.
And just one thing to add there, I know kids here legally have issues working part-time jobs and sort of thing, but I'm sure, Sean, you're the same way. I didn't work my way through high school, but I certainly always had side hustles going on, doing this, doing that. Just find something in the real world where you learn a little bit about how the real world functions. Maybe when you go back to going to the offices, your mom or dad would have some friend that you can just make copies for a week over the holiday. Just have not even internships, just something real worldy that just provide you a little bit of perspective. And of course, maybe also provide you with a great something to write about when it comes to your essays. So yeah, real world experience. Not so if you have the holiday, don't just sit around and play computer games. Go to mom or dad's office for a couple of days to see how the real world sort of functions. I'm shocked more and more every year by how naive the students I work with are, who really, a lot of them have no clue what their parents do for a living. They just, oh, he works at a bank. Well, what does he do? So just understanding a little bit more about that real world will come through, particularly if you have to interview with anybody for these American schools or UK schools. They're going to expect your ability to talk about things like that. But that's a whole different webinar entirely about how to apply and package yourself. What do? Premium standardized test preparation for the SAT. Whoops. We used to do programs for ACT, but I will not prepare for kids for a test I don't think they're going to be able to take. We've seen a spate of kids moving back to the States, looking to take the SSAT and ISEE, that are the tests to get into American high schools. Those tests are kind of available now. You kind of got to get lucky. But it's the same in the States. Most boarding schools in America are dropping the requirement. Check with the school. We've been here since 2001 doing this. I started teaching with a company called Testtakers in New York City for money when I was an undergrad at Columbia. All of our teachers are at graduates from American universities. SAT prep, again, only for 11th and 12th graders. In-person prep, we do it now at Balmoral Plaza. We kind of co-lease a tuition center there. All relevant social distancing and whatnot is followed. For the March test date, we're taking advantage of the holiday. Normally, in years past, I'd be someplace like Mexico for the winter holiday, but now I'm very much stuck here like everyone else. So we have 3 different options leading to the March test date. They're taking advantage of that school holiday period. During that period, also, we have our grammar and reading 101 programs that are relevant for 9th, 10th, 11th graders who want to get off to an early start on things. Again, not test prep, reading and grammar skills that are poorly learned nowadays. Again, Mojo shirts Oglala, cross the river by feeling for stones. Don't worry too much about it. There's certain things you can change, certain things you can't. A lot of times I'm just telling people, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it now because you don't know what the situation is going to be next year. Will the test be required by Dartmouth in 2024? I don't know. Dartmouth doesn't know. So just kind of sometimes it's best to step back and do very little if you can't have a direct impact on things. And you don't want to do a bunch of things that ultimately aren't required or even looked at. And talk to your school guidance counselor. That's the final thing. Sean, any final thoughts there?
No, I think, as you said, Jeremy, well, everything in the world right now is in flux, not just SAT prep, but travel. The travel bubble was about to open up in Hong Kong just a few days ago, and then it was canceled. So who knows what could come about. I think the main thing is, if students are studying hard and doing well, universities are going to want them. As I always tell and remind my students, and sometimes I think students kind of forget this, but you're purchasing an education. You're paying a lot of money to go to these universities. And while most universities aren't for profit, they need money to pay their bills. They have loans. They've built these big dormitories and they have to pay back these loans on the dormitories. So they're going to need students. That's the one thing I can promise that won't change. Every country in the world really likes to have international students because international students pay more and they help the funding gap with governments cutting funding to higher educational institutes around the world, whether it be Canada, the US, Australia, the UK. They need international students more and more. And as long as you've got good grades and you've shown that you're going to be successful at their university, they're going to want you on their campus.
Okay, yeah, I can't stress that enough. Universities need students to keep the lights on everywhere. And in America, we just reached peak student, was it 2 years ago, Sean? Where the number of domestic students reached its max demographically. So a lot of universities are just going to go away. A lot of universities are going to merge. This was just starting to happen pre-COVID, and this is going to accelerate the process. But again, being an international student, it should be, I don't know, it's tough to say easier or harder, but it's not going to get any harder moving forward to get into universities. All right, Sean, so let's maybe turn to the Q&A. Anything pops out that we haven't, or anything that came in? I'm going to stop sharing here.
Only one thing came in through the Q&A, and that was something about if you don't do well on the essay part of the SAT, can you choose not to give the essay score? Normally, when you send your scores, yeah, go ahead, Jeremy. Sorry.
No, yeah, you can just send it without the essay. And most schools don't care about the essay anyway. Yeah,
most schools don't really look at the essay. And again, I can almost promise you, you're not going to do poorly on the essay section.
Yeah,
students that are coming from a good education system like the ones in Singapore and Southeast Asia, you're being taught how to write well. And compared to a lot of US students in public schools where teachers have 40 kids in a classroom and don't have time to really read long essays, you're going to do quite well. I've never really had a student that didn't do that well in the essay part. The 15 years.
And honestly, if you can't, like I said earlier, if you can't write a 5-paragraph essay by this point, what have you been learning? So it's not going to be that bad. One other question I just see that came in here: do we expect 2022 students to be optional? Yes, we fully expect all American universities, with maybe a couple exceptions in Florida, to be test optional through the next admission cycle. So that the kids are now 11th graders would be looking at a test optional world. That said, we didn't touch on this too much. Schools in Singapore, in particular, NUS and NTU and SMU, they have really weird requirements for IB students who aren't Singaporean. They don't make it easy. And they have very stringent, strict requirements for the SAT. So look on those schools' websites where they make it hard to find, or talk to your guidance counselors.
Speaking of NUS and NTU, one question did come in and sort of said, are there minimum scores for NUS and NTU for the SAT? There's no absolute minimum score. But if you're not aware, NUS and NTU are remarkably competitive for Singaporeans and even more competitive for international students. So while there's not a minimum score, if you need the SAT for NUS or NTU, then it's going to be very competitive. Keep in mind, if you're doing the full IB diploma or you're doing A levels, then you don't need to take the SAT.
Okay, one thing I see that came up on the chat, it was a very good point, that athletes, students who are being recruited for NCAA still have the SAT requirement, the SAT minimum. And normally, depending on the sport, they sometimes have to test during 10th grade, which I just think is ludicrous, but that's the NCAA kind of rule. Sean, have you heard about NCAA might sort of wake up to the fact that they're being stupid, or is that just the way it is for now?
Haven't heard much about that, to be very honest. I know that
I've had instances where graders.
Yeah. There was talk that they might sort of get rid of this. I think the NCAA, because they're just an archaic institution and very slow to change, they could hold off on some of these. I think they'll be forced to bend the rules a little bit, because keep in mind that, just as Jeremy said, a lot of students in the US haven't had the opportunity to take it. One thing to remember is that at a lot of schools in the US, not all states, but in many states, taking the ACT or SAT is actually something that happens like on a school day.
Yeah, so, school testing.
So it's a little bit different than here, where you have to come in and unfortunately do it on a Saturday morning, which is a bit cruel. So that's a good point. I think talk to your university advisor about that and see. I think keep in mind that for the NCAA, they're never able to sort of guarantee a scholarship. They might even, you might sign an early letter where they're sort of saying, we're going to accept you and you're going to come and play with us in your sophomore, junior year of high school. But keep in mind, they generally can always sort of back out on that. And that does happen to students. They say, look, we really like you. We want you to be the star tennis player on our team. But then later on, they find another tennis player that's much better than you. They can say, oh, wait, we've changed our mind. So,
or you blow out your ankle, and then that's that.
Yeah.
Yeah. One thing that came in just on the Q&A is test optional really that when other kids from your school are submitting an SAT score, would you put you at a disadvantage if you don't submit one? My answer to that would be sort of nuanced, saying, well, it depends on the SAT score. It depends on your other grades. If other people submit an SAT score that is wonderful, that will help them. But again, if you're applying to those super competitive schools, it's going to be really in the IB grade or your GPA that's going to make the difference. And if you score really well on the IB, you're probably also going to do really well on the SAT.
Yeah, I think just to reiterate, universities are going to look at your grades first. The SAT is, as Jeremy said, it's not a content test, it's sort of an aptitude test. And what I always tell my students is if your grades are sort of low and you do really well in the SAT, you've shown them that you have the aptitude to do well at university. You just haven't been applying yourself the past 3 years. And so it's sort of a disadvantage for you to have sort of poor grades and then a really high SAT score, because that sort of flags to the university that you actually just haven't been sort of studying hard.
Yeah, you're lazy.
Yeah, that you're lazy. I didn't want to use those words, but yes, you're lazy.
No, you're lazy. You're lazy. And again, I think if all things equal, if two kids have the exact same IB all the way through, and one kid submits great SAT scores, they're probably going to be a slight advantage for the most competitive American universities. But that advantage will be slight. And if it's a question of you can't take the SAT just because you can't get a seat, which is the issue facing a lot of students in Singapore and indeed the world right now, then the schools can't hold that against you. So I've talked to some people who are arranging to smuggle their kids over to Batam because they can take the test there. That's just crazy town. No, if you can't take it, don't worry about it. Schools will take that into consideration, and they will not look at that score. Or they won't see that as a detrimental to your actual application. It was kind of like they won't look at that area. So they say. Again, and that got people sign off on that. And Sean, just looking at the other questions that came in prior, I think we've hit on most of them that are within the remit of what we're talking about. Also, again, I encourage everyone to check that blog posting that I just put up a few days ago, because that has a lot of the more specific questions answered as well. And any questions about testing and whatnot, you can email me. That email is all over my website. You got emails from me already. And any questions specifically about your child and universities and whatnot, talk to your university guidance counselor is our standard hot take. And particularly 11th graders, this is the time when they start looking at, they start kind of stop worrying about the 12th graders. Let's start worrying about the 11th graders next few months. Another question came in, says, is Yale and US test optional and test blind? Ask Yale and US. I guarantee within a few clicks on the Google, you can get that information from Yale and US, but probably test optional. But again, I wouldn't want to speak for my friends down there. But that information is specific to schools. The best people to check is the school, not asking someone else. It's checking the school website, and they should answer that question. If not, email them or call them up and get a response. And here, luckily, Yale and US, you can do that.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Just always go straight to the source to find that out, because keep in mind, while I know that in the past, they've accepted full IB diploma students without SAT scores. So I can tell you that was the situation a couple of years ago. They might have changed that in the past month, and I haven't perhaps got the update on that.
Yeah,
so it's required if a student had the full IB diploma, but that might have changed. So every time a student or parent asks me that, I'll tell them exactly what I know as of a few months ago. But I always say you should verify that from the university directly. And I'd actually add, as a guidance counselor, part of our program here at my school is actually, we want students to be able to send formal emails. So it's good practice to have your son or daughter, please parents, don't send that email to the university, because that's sort of saying, hey, I'm a parent, my kid can't even send their own email. So one of the learning outcomes at our school is that students learn how to write a formal email, which is something a lot of students have trouble with because they're used to using TikTok or Facebook or Twitter. So part of the program at GEMS is we actually make sure, one of the first activities I do is all the students send a formal email. I sort of double check to make sure that it's written properly. I talk to them about how to write a good salutation. And then they have to write an email to an institution and asking a good question. So certainly have your son or daughter reach out to the institution and ask that question.
And just to combine that, the schools in Singapore are kind of renowned for changing the goalposts halfway. So make sure that you get whatever their stated rules and regs are in writing. Take that email and then print it out and put it in a safe deposit box, and then photocopy it and save it somewhere else, because things might change next week. So you want something you can kind of refer to. And I know a lot of kids have been sort of caught out. So again, that's it. That concludes this part of the operation. And now we're going to bring in Eddie to talk a little bit about something completely different. Again, any formal questions that we haven't addressed, go ahead and contact us. We'll get you the answer or let you know that we don't know. Okay, hello, Eddie. Are you there?
Yes, I am. It's good to
Here we
see.
have Eddie joining us from darkest Malaysia.
Yeah, fresh out of the 14-day quarantine. It's good to kind of be out
Oh,
there.
you gotta go through all that. That's got to be fun.
That was fascinating, to be honest. I learned a lot about myself during that period of self-isolation.
Yeah, well, hopefully this too shall pass. So we're just going to run through my questions real quickly, Eddie, and thank you very much for putting in the time to help us out with this. I always like to talk to people who have had successful careers, obviously, but have had successful careers that weren't related in any way to what they studied in school, just so kids and
Sure.
parents can understand that education is not a destination. Education just supports you to do something else later on. So I'm just going to sort of run through here. Now, Eddie, tell me, where did you grow up? What's your childhood like? Let's talk about you, Eddie.
Yeah, I think it's safe to say that I had a very unique childhood, mostly because my father was the Malaysian ambassador to quite a few countries. So ever since I was born, I was born in Switzerland, in Geneva, and I would just be perpetually moving every 2 to 3 years, and uprooting myself and just kind of adjusting to a whole new environment, a whole new school, or a whole new place. So I've been fortunate enough to live in quite a few countries. I've been brought up in, I've lived in Seoul, Korea, Saudi Arabia, and Jeddah, Brussels, Belgium, Beijing, China. Briefly, I was in Manila, and I'm sure that there are a lot more that I'm forgetting, but it's been a very fortunate ride. And I have my parents to absolutely thank for that.
And I know your parents well, so please send them my best. And so
Absolutely.
which school did you settle in for high school then, for secondary?
So I went to UWC, United World College in Singapore.
Okay, you went to UC Dover back then, right? I mean, back then it's only one.
Yeah, back then it was definitely less kind of claustrophobic, let's put it that way. So it had like a really kind of nice open campus. It was really just the one place on Dover. And I got there specifically to do my IB. Before that, I was at the International School of Beijing. So a lot of my childhood was spent in various kind of international or American schools. But we decided to kind of do international baccalaureate purely because I just found it like a much more interesting course, because there's a lot more to it that I could do, which felt really exciting.
Were you a boarder or just a regular day student at UWC?
Oh, I went all in, so I was a boarder. Yeah.
Oh, all in. Okay, you're one of the old boys then. And then thinking back to that time, what was your favorite IB subject that you did? I won't ask you your subject combinations, but what was the one you look forward to?
I would have to say that it would definitely be it would either be English or art, and those are both my hires. I also, I mean, look, surprisingly, I did enjoy French as well, but I think for me that was just something that was kind of related to my childhood. Way back then, I had already started to kind of learn French, and it just felt like the right thing to kind of follow through on. But I would absolutely say, yeah, English and art were just like, two of my most kind of exciting courses.
And did you have to do an extended essay back then? Was that part of the IB as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I did my extended essay. No, I know I did my extended essay in art. Yeah.
Okay, so like art history?
It was, yeah, I was looking at like the influence of religion. Like it was focused more on Malaysian artists or Malaysian contemporary artists, and how culture and heritage and Islam played like a part in kind of helping them find their voice and their narrative.
Oh, that sounds, I'd like to read that. It should be very interesting. And then when you're looking at universities, what was your process of looking at schools? Was it only UK, or do you look at schools elsewhere, or was it all preordained?
I have to say a lot of it was just kind of preordained. At that age, I wasn't too kind of sure about what I wanted to pursue. So I definitely had like a few conversations with my guidance counselor, and felt like at the time, since I was fairly proficient in courses like English and history, and I did economics as well, I think they were very much pushing me to do a law degree, because it kind of felt like what everyone in my family was doing. So I had no violent reaction against it, and I was more than happy to just kind of give it a go. So I thought, why not? So I did, yeah, I did my LLB. I went to like the University of Warwick. I had like a few, I think there were like two places that I was keen to kind of go to. It was either the University of Warwick or King's College in London. I think I was definitely more keen on being in the UK, purely because there were friends going at that time, and I got into Warwick, and did 3 years of law.
And then afterwards, were you called to the bar, or what was you ever a formal lawyer?
No, I think it was safe to say that in the second year of doing the LLB, I was quite sure that I didn't necessarily wanted to kind of pursue a career in law. So a lot of the courses that I found really exciting or just really interesting were the ones that had more of like a sociological approach to it. So stuff like women in the law, family law, like really trying to see how the law has affected individuals, people, families. Stuff like contract law, tort, and all that. I mean, it was okay. I was okay at it, but I didn't necessarily kind of find it riveting. So towards the end of that, I mean, when I graduated at Warwick, I was still very much open to pursuing other avenues or opportunities that weren't necessarily related to law at all.
And I think the big difference in the UK and America, obviously in America, law is a graduate program, where when you get to law school, you're committed to being a lawyer. Whereas in the UK, I guess because kids are so young when they make that decision, I think probably more kids do law and end up doing something completely different. Whereas if you go to law school in America, you're pretty much all in as a lawyer. That's what you're going to do.
It's pretty much ordained. So yeah, I mean, there were a lot of people at that time that was doing law in the UK that still kind of moved on to like other things. They weren't necessarily going to practice.
And then what was the most important non-academic thing that you learned in university?
I think, probably I think it's safe to say that my 3 years at Warwick, or just being at university, was life-changing, purely because it was an opportunity for me to really kind of explore who I am, what I'm about, what kind of tribe I belong in, what are the things that I generally feel kind of passionate for, right? So I think that was a huge opportunity for me to just kind of mix with so many different people. And for me, it wasn't just about the social aspect of it. I mean, of course, that's just, amazing. But it was really just having the opportunity just to kind of meet different people from different courses, doing different things from various walks of life, and just having these kind of really interesting kind of, learning sessions about what makes them tick, what they wanted to do in their lives, what they saw themselves kind of becoming in the near future. And I think that for me was invaluable. As great as it is having this kind of international upbringing, following my parents and living in all these different kind of cities and places, I think it was nice to just kind of be settled for a while at Warwick for 3 years, but just having the world kind of surround you, so to speak. And I found that like hugely invaluable.
And I think a lot of kids, university is about finding your path, as you said, finding your tribe, learning how to do laundry, learning how to make cup noodles yourself, and just sort of finding yourself really without mom or dad hovering behind you, sort of doing everything for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I lost a lot of weight because living with my mother, she would give me like 5 meals a day, right? So there's a great opportunity to kind of, lose some extra kind of kgs.
Yeah, and Warwick back then was exactly a gastronomical destination, I'd imagine.
Yeah, and even if you kind of went to the city center, the nearest city center was really Coventry. Look, I look back on it fondly now, but I mean, Coventry wasn't really all that. You know what I mean? You're better off just taking the train to London.
After the Germans got done with it, right? So yeah. So anyway, anyone from Coventry up the line, let's move on from there. Okay, and then young Eddie, he graduates from college, and then what does he do?
And so he decides to go back to Malaysia again, I was very curious to kind of figure out what it meant to kind of be back home, whatever that meant, right? Because I never really lived in Malaysia for that long, or I don't really recall much of Malaysia during my childhood. So there were two reasons I decided to go back to KL, mostly because I wanted to spend some time with my family. But also, yeah, I just thought it would be like an interesting opportunity to see what the job market was like back home. So I did that. I did all kinds of odd jobs, which, you know, when I look back at it now, I found them all kind of useful in some weird way. I did like direct sales. I worked with this company where, you know, it's not even like the cool bit of direct sales. I'm talking about like being a door-to-door salesman and just kind of walking to different businesses, knocking on doors, talking to random people. And we were trying to sell like these, you know, interesting kind of discount cards or gift vouchers for like all kinds of different establishments. But that for me was a wonderful crash course in terms of just meeting people and just understanding, you know, like the different types of people or characters that you're going to meet across KL, right? But it was very short-lived. I think I just did that for about 2 months. And then after that, I was a writer for a men's magazine, Men's Review. I think, and it wasn't even really a full-time job. I was just helping to kind of, I was just like a contributor now and then. But while I was doing that, I met a person, a friend of mine who suggested a gig as a copywriter in this local agency. And I wasn't really sure what it entailed, but again, I was kind of open to seeing what it's about. I met a few of the people there. It seemed like a really interesting setup. I like the notion of telling stories and creating kind of narratives and things that kind of potentially help, you know, sell products. So I decided to give that a go, and the next thing I know, I was basically in advertising for about 10 years. So from that local agency, I went to an international agency.
Okay.
Yeah, in KL. So from that local agency, I went to an international agency, which was Ogilvy and then McCann. And then I was headhunted to go to go to TBWA in Singapore for a regional role there, which was really exciting. So I was handling accounts like Adidas, Standard Chartered Bank, Singapore Airlines, and all that. So that was really interesting.
You've always been on the creative side, so you're the Don Draper who tells them what they need to do, right?
Yeah, I mean that's a very romanticized version of what Adland is about. But yeah, I mean, even back in my day when I was in advertising, yeah, it was a bit more kind of rock and roll, so to speak, right? But yeah, I started off as a copywriter, writing headlines and body copy and all that stuff, and coming up with ideas and writing scripts. Naturally, you start to rise up the ranks and become like a senior creative or creative group head, and eventually I became a creative director. So I found that really exciting purely because, I mean, the job was very taxing and there's a lot of, you know, crazy hours, but I think there's a huge sense of camaraderie, you know, and you're really in it together, right, with everyone in that agency. So it's you know, you have like these really interesting bonds that are forged because of these high pressure situations that you're in. But I think for me, after a while, you know, I definitely had like another itch, and I was really eager to challenge myself creatively. And I knew that I wouldn't find that just going to another creative agency. So it was very fortunate that at the time there happened to be an opening at Google. And I just kind of...
That's a big company, right?
It's okay. It's doing okay, I think. You know what I mean? I think it's a thing. I mean...
It's around. It's around.
It's around.
Yeah. So, and then...
But I mean...
No, in your time in the agencies, was there anything you did in university that had direct utility in terms of academics?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So I think that the wonderful thing about law, just as a discipline, is that it really teaches you, first of all, how to make a compelling case, or how to kind of state like a very kind of concise argument, right? Advertising ultimately is about persuasion, right? So you need to kind of help persuade a client. You need to help tell a story that makes this product seem so much more interesting than it actually is. So there is so much about law and the discipline that you get from that really helps you to kind of use pretty much those same skills in a slightly different way. I think if anything, I am very glad that I started off with law, as opposed to doing like some sort of, you know, degree in marketing or comms or, you know, whatever that is, because I feel that to be a really interesting creative, you should be able to kind of tap into so many different kind of industries or aspects or, you know, put on like so many different hats, right? Because it just makes you more well-rounded just as a thinker, purely because you've kind of absorbed different things.
Mass comm or something, you're just siloed off in that little
Yeah, because
academic-ish vocational.
it just feels, yeah, very suffocating and almost incestuous, right? You're just seeing the same old thing, right? The world is telling you, oh, this is a great ad because, yeah, it's a great ad, but maybe not, right? The aim is not to replicate what's been out there or what's been done. It's to kind of tap into new areas that can be a new form of inspiration where you kind of, connect these seemingly disparate or random dots, but interpret it in a new way that still feels pretty compelling.
Well, and then marketing as well is it's all about communication, and lawyers learn how to communicate, complex ideas. You distill it to something more palatable, and that training is key. Because I think a lot of people, particularly in the American perspective, look at advertising and say, well, you have to do psychology. That's where you start. You don't necessarily have to do so. And most creatives I know did something completely kind of random. They did this, that, the other thing. You don't go to Stanford to study advertising. It doesn't work that way.
Absolutely. I mean, some of the best ad men that I've met used to be like bouncers, used to be bartenders, used to kind of have like the most kind of weirdest kind of career paths before ending up in these very impressive gigs at some of the biggest kind of agencies in the world.
Yeah, and so like a lot of my friends who work in finance, they were engineers. They didn't do any economics or finance but they were just really good at math and figured it out. So what we're driving at these very interesting talks is what you study in the IB or what you study at university has really no bearing whatsoever, and what you or your kids are going to be doing in 15, 20 years. Because the old aphorism that all the jobs of 20 years from now haven't been invented yet. So Google 20 years ago is nothing. So, but
I think
Eddie, you've explained this to me before, but what do you do?
Okay. I'll try and kind of distill this in a way that doesn't sound like too weird or pretentious, but it might still come across as a bit pretentious. I am within a team at Google that is called the Partner Innovation Team, right? And we are a motley crew of I think about 20 people now, with various kind of skill sets and backgrounds. It's a combination of creative people, engineers, like some people who used to kind of have like their own startups, so real hustlers and entrepreneurs and whatnot, and producers. And I mean, we consider ourselves almost like a think tank of sorts. And our role is to try and figure out how Google can tell the most compelling stories from a brand perspective, or how we can come up with interesting creative use cases for some of their new and emerging tech or some of their existing products or platforms, right? So we could be doing something for AR and VR, right? One case in hand is something that we did with the Art Science Museum. If anyone went maybe about a few months ago, we did like this interesting AR exhibit together with Netflix, and it's called Our Planet, right? So we're trying to see how we can kind of visualize how delicate Mother Earth is, and what your role is in that whole experience, or what you can do to potentially help. So every project we do is very different. It really depends on the market. It really depends on the team that we're working with, which is why, even though we all come from different backgrounds within this team, there is like a very unique hustle, or the ability just to be hugely flexible and just kind of adapt to whatever that project or engagement may be. But I think what's great about the crew is that we're all fundamentally wired to solve and try and figure things out. In the absence of information, in the absence of clarity, I think there are some very unique skills that we all have that's really about trying to figure out the complexity of this organization that is Google, right? And just trying to see how you produce.
Yeah, ultimately Google is your client.
For the most part, yeah, a lot of our projects, Google is our client, whether that's Google marketing or people from the engineering team or a product lead. Yeah.
Hmm. So it's almost like a within Google skunkworks type thing for.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. Absolutely.
Is it global, or just Asia is your remit, or is there people everywhere?
It's our team has a regional kind of responsibility, so they don't. I think if anything, APAC is the market that's kind of ripe, or at least has a hunger for innovation, purely because of the sheer complexity of this market. You know what I mean? I think when you deal with EMEA, Americas, they're kind of, I mean, sorry to say this, but kind of stuck in their ways, right? There's a lot more kind of red tape and, you know, protocol and procedures that you have to follow. Whereas APAC is still kind of like the wild, wild east, you know? And I think everyone's hungry to innovate and experiment and to try something different and new, which is why our team is doing fairly well here.
A company like Google could be very easy for them to like do split tests or try different strategies or different iterations of products in different individual markets to figure out what's best, and use this almost as like a proving ground before they roll it out. And, you know,
absolutely. I think, yeah, no, I 100% agree. Like a lot of the projects that we do, I think we almost have a bit more permission to play, purely because, yeah, it's, you know, like at the end of the day, oh, you know what, if that's going to work in Jakarta because that's what the user is like, or that's what the infrastructure of the tech is like, yeah, go ahead, give it a go, see if it works. Whatever the case is, success or whether you succeed or fail, there's still going to be learnings from it, and then we can kind of adapt accordingly, right? So everything is a learning process for us. I think for us, done is better than perfect. It's just having that kind of mindset where, you know, and that was the problem that I probably had when I was at school or at university, right? It's almost like you have to nail this exam, or like it has to be perfect, or, you know, it's the end of the world, right? And you build up this, you know, this tension, and the expectations that you place on yourself can be so brutal sometimes. But the reality is that at the end of the day, the world requires you to be very adaptable and very open and very kind of flexible, because that's the only way that you're really going to succeed, from my point of view.
In academics and all things, you learn more by failing than by succeeding. And
absolutely,
you learn more. You know, I played basketball. You learn more getting blown out by 20 points than you do winning by 20 points. And I think increasingly kids today, they maybe don't have enough bitterness in their life. They never, in Chinese you say 吃苦, to eat bitterness. And then once they go into the real world, they're all of a sudden, oh, that company doesn't want me to work for them? How is that possible? But I'm great. So a lot of them can have a bit of a reality check in a few years. I certainly am not shy in my classes in doing so. So when you're, I'm not sure how involved you are in hiring and whatnot in your role, but when you interact with people, is where they went to school or what they did, you know, when they're 18 to 22 years old, relevant to your perception of them? Or is it more in your industry, just what you've done in that space?
Yeah, so I think there are a few factors at play, especially when it comes to, you know, who we choose to kind of bring on board, at least for our team, right? So I think academics and the kind of educational kind of upbringing or background that you've had, sure, it does play a part, but it's not really the thing that we're looking for, right? Ultimately for us, yeah, experience matters more. And for me, it's not just about experience. It's like, what have you actually achieved or made or contributed to within that role, right? Because I think, you know, you can find like a lot of articulate people, a lot of people who are very likable. You know, I mean, naturally, you're going to gravitate towards someone that you feel that you're vibing with for whatever reason, right? But I think at the end of the day, it's one thing for them to say all the right things. There are some things that you can only just tell just by meeting them and just really kind of being face to face, right? So for a lot of the stuff that we look out for, you know, it's less about that kind of educational kind of the typical stuff that you would expect, right, in terms of the grades. Because to be honest, none of that really factors in. I think we're really kind of interested in just seeing how curious you are as a human being. What kind of energy levels do you kind of give off? Do you have a hunger and appetite?
Do you take people from the existing Google pool? So, or do you take people from outside?
No, we take, you know, it can be someone who is already at Google, but from another team, or someone who is outside of Google as well. I mean, the interesting thing about Google, though, is that anyone who comes in at Google, I think from what I understand, or what someone told me recently, I think about like 95% of the people who are eventually hired at Google, it's through like another Googler who's kind of like recommended them or vouched for them. You know what I mean? And I think at the end of the day, you know, when you're out there in the real world trying to kind of, you know, figure out what your first gig is, I think my advice to everyone is to just really put yourself out there. I mean, just network, talk to people, park aside your bias of what you think is a cool job and what isn't a cool job. I think the reality is that there is no cool job. I think the role is what you make of it. I think as long as you have the opportunity just to kind of get that experience, and if you feel that there's something that you can gain from any role, I say go for it. It'll just make you better in some way, shape, or form. Even if you hate it, it's still good because you learn from that.
And when you're in university, I didn't ask this earlier, but did you ever intern or work when you're in uni, or was it just straight up academics for you?
I mean, I did stuff. I mean, I just worked at the students' union, you know what I mean? But I wouldn't really call that work. It was just still like a very social kind of thing, you know?
Okay, yeah, I can see that. Yeah, because I went to school. I was lucky enough to go to school in New York City, where at one point I think I had 4 gigs at the same time, 4 little part-time jobs running around
Wow.
ragged. But I learned so much about different industries. I worked on Wall Street.
Yeah.
I worked in a headhunter. You do all these little jobs for $10 an hour, and then you can be better informed about what you want to do, maybe, and what you don't want to do.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
you know, and having that experience is definitely key. Not just studying the entire time. That's not the point.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, okay, Eddie. Well, I love to talk more, but certainly let us know when you're back in Singapore. We'll go out and grab some food. All the best to Mark and Nina and the parents. And thank you very much for your time. And to those of you on the webinar, certainly went a little bit over, but that's just okay. And again, this will be up on the YouTube and on my website in the next 72 hours or so. Things have to process through. Okay, so thank you again, Sean, for spending your evening with us. Thank you, Eddie, for dialing in from KL, and all the best to all of you. And just take a couple deep breaths. Everything's going to be okay. And hopefully things now are going to get better rather than worse.
Yeah. Thank you for having us.
Okay.
Thank you for doing the webinar.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye. Take care, Eddie.